Good morning. Morning. Thanks. Hello, and for those of you who are new, welcome to the church. For those of you who are here all the time, welcome back to the church. Lovely to see you as always. Today is our Insight Sunday program, and for those of you who are not aware of what this program is, it's a recurring series where we spotlight a particular work by an artist, and we get the behind the scenes look of the process, the insight. That's why it's called Insight Sunday, and kind of the wisdom and the lessons learned as working on this work. I am pleased to welcome Michelle Fiordaliso. Sorry, my apologies, and Lindsay Morris. Michelle wrote a collection of essays, and it is in a book called Rejected, and it's essays on belonging. And correct me if I'm wrong, all of those essays were at one point rejected, right? Hence the title. So just so that you guys are aware, the book is on sale at the back for $10. So at the end of this talk, if you'd like to purchase a book, please head to the back. And I also have one little other announcement. We have a current artist in residence with us named Robin Smith, who is downstairs in our studio level, and we would like to invite all of you to a studio visit after this talk. So after this talk, if you want to join us downstairs in the studio to kind of see Robin's work and see what she's working on, please feel free. I'm going to stop yammering and let you two ladies take it off. Thank you.
Hello, is mine? Hello, yes? Okay.
Hello.
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Michelle.
Hello, Lindsay.
What's going on?
Not too much. It's a beautiful Sunday in Sag Harbor.
It is. Thanks, everyone, for coming out on this glorious day.
And sharing your fall warm days. We don't know how many of them we have left, so thank you for being inside with us. I wanted to talk a little bit about finding ourselves here in Sag Harbor and all of the micro movements that took us to be here in this room together today. I started coming to the East End of Long Island when I was a small child. My dad, who's here today, we went to Montauk when I was a toddler, and then we had a house in Springs starting when I was 10, and so I have split my time in life between the East End of Long Island and Queens and Brooklyn and Manhattan and Los Angeles. And so it's a place that is very dear to me. And Sag Harbor is interesting for two reasons. One is that one of my first memories of being around Sag Harbor, speaking of rejected, I had a child in 2000, and his father had an affair when he was 2 months old, and that made me have to make a decision of where I was going to go. And I decided to come and live on the East End of Long Island. Back then, getting a year-round rental was not expensive, so I shared a house in Watermill with Adelaide Mestry, who's also performed here at the church, and you know, it cost me $600 a month to have this big, beautiful house in Watermill. And I tried to find a way to fit into this new community. And I joined a music class, and Lindsay was in the music class with her infant son, and there began my sense of community here out on the East End. That was one of the many times I lived here, but that was when I came to live here year-round. And community has always been a superpower for me. I have built community because I need community, and those were skills that I kind of had to learn. So, and Kate Muth, who I'll give a little plug, I met in the kite shop when we both had sons on our hips, and we became close friends, and she's got an event over at Bay Street, so if you today at 2:30 doesn't conflict with us, so if you're not saturated with art, go over there next and see Kate and Jana, who's here. And also Sag Harbor was the beginning of my writing life because I joined a writing group that was started by Erica Duncan, and it was in her house on 114. And then it later became a whole movement called Her Story, which maybe some of you know about. And that was the start of my writing class and my writing life. And it was this very interesting class because it was me, who was 22 at the time, writing about my mostly sexual endeavors with two old men and women and all kinds of escapades. And so it was me and this English man who came from a family of aristocracy, and if he wanted to see his childhood furniture, he had to go to the Met, where it was cordoned off by velvet ropes. It was a Turkish princess whose mother used to have lunch with Hitler, and it was Pia Lindstrom and me. So, and they were like, "You look like a normal person. Why are you writing this stuff?" So, and you know, I mean, I thought lunch with Hitler was more fringe than what I was doing, but you know. Anyway, so it's a place that is important to me. And so yesterday, Lindsay and Julie and I, we took a walk around Sag Harbor, and we were debating, do we go walk in the woods or do we walk through the town? And we did this sort of unconventional walk that none of us had done, and kind of looked at the town with new eyes. And we noticed the architecture and who lived here and who lived there. And Lindsay has this great project which was at Duck Walk, and maybe you've seen it, called Meet Your Neighbor, where she photographs her neighbors and holding objects that are dear to them. And so we kind of just walked through and went to the stores, bumped into people, saw dogs hanging out of cars. We had a great discussion with Randy, who I see back there, who was in the cemetery, and you can ask him about something really exciting that's in the cemetery over by the Whaling Church. And it was this wonderful experience of seeing a familiar place with new eyes. And we, at one moment, were walking, and we noticed all the churches that are sort of visible from one to the other. And we're in one of them now, and tried to imagine this notion that the people of Sag Harbor on a Sunday morning would have been out in their finest, going to their respective churches. And why do we go to church? You know, we go to church, for those that do, to be in community with other people and to find something like-minded, to find a sense of connection, to find each other after a busy week. And this got moved to noontime because some people had worship that they wanted to do on a Sunday morning, whether it's that they go to church, or their church is now yoga, or their church is a dip in the bay, or a walk, or time with family to get bagels or carissas or whatever. And but we have that desire to belong. And I guess that leads me to this notion of this book that is paradoxically called Rejected: Essays on Belonging. And so I thought we'd tell you a little bit about how this book came to be. I do too.
Hello?
There you go.
There I am. Hello.
Okay.
I think you're doing a great job. Please continue. I'm just
You
completely
think it's like
enamored.
Mystery Science Theater. Just give some comments every once
I'm
in a
learning
while.
so much about you. Duck Walk is a winery, just to be clear. It was Duck Creek where we had the show. I did not have a show at a winery. Carry
Okay, well,
on, but I'd like to.
Part of the writing process is, you know, some writers will say writing is rewriting, so please edit any typos.
I'll just jump
throughout.
in here and there.
So Rejected, here I guess I'm supposed to hold it up. I have a couple of visual aids. So also tying to an East End story is I have part of writing for any of you. How many people write out here? A lot. How many people are photographers? A lot. How many people are artists of other kinds? Okay. How many people have submitted their work and got rejected at some point? Okay. All right, so we are in community. We have this thing in common here in this room called rejection. So we can all empathize. It's a safe space. And don't feel embarrassed to tell your stories because we've all got them. I When the Modern Love column came out, which many of you this morning got this in your paper, if you got a paper or looked online, 20 years ago, and the first essay in it actually was written by somebody who spends a lot of time here on the East End, rents a place in Amagansett, Steve Friedman. He wrote the very first Modern Love, and I didn't know him at the time, but I do know him now. And I just wanted to be published in that column. And I submitted and was rejected, submitted and was rejected. And then finally I was on a hike in LA where I lived, and I got an email saying that a piece of mine was accepted, and I thought it was gonna disappear. Now, that he was gonna change his mind, and then he didn't change his mind. It published on Mother's Day of 2012. And there are two things about it. It was a wonderful experience after many years of 8 years at that point of wanting to be published there. And sometimes in life we do get what we want. And it was also like, I meditate with Ramesh, who's there in the back, and one of these phrases in discussions about enlightenment is before enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. So the piece published, and the day was like wonderful in many ways and also like anything else in many ways. I had laundry to do. I got into a fight with my son. There were meals to cook. It was a day like any other day. And I realized that these things don't really make a difference. These things that we chase don't really make that much of a difference in the end. So do them if you want to do them. Don't do them if you don't want to do them. But that's not what makes a difference. When you do a Google search or you ask AI to tell you what is the most important thing about being human, it is connection and it is belonging. And so those things got very right-sized for me in terms of having my work be something that I do. I happen to have been born with a compulsion to create, and it is an immovable, unstoppable force in me. It also doesn't identify who I am. And that has taken time, and we'll talk about that because the rejection process was very painful for a long time. And so that one published on 2012. And then, and it sort of is like one of these columns that is most coveted place for writers to be published because they've had, 800,000 submissions and only 1,400 pieces published there. And then in 2016, I had a second piece published there, which has only happened to a tiny handful of writers. And it was published on the Sunday before Election Day, 2016. And the editor felt it was the message that the country needed at that particular time. I don't know if it had the intended effect, but it was what he felt. Anyway, that leads me to the notion of rejected. So I know what it's been like to be accepted. And then there are other times when I'll write a piece, I feel it's a good piece, I'm satisfied with it, and I'll start sending it out to editors, and it's no, I'm gonna pass on this one, or sorry, not the right time, or we just said yes to a piece just like this, or someone famous is writing on that topic and they're gonna get more clicks than you would, or whatever kind of reason. And so I decided that I, at some point over time, came to this decision that I was going to collect them in one place. And I kind of almost thought I'd have like a list before each essay of all the places that rejected it, because I thought that would be kind of funny. I didn't do that, but some are obvious and some are not. And then naturally, I kind of came through this process where a couple of the stories Lindsay, as I shared, we met in 2000, and so I'm a longtime supporter of her photography work, and many of you probably know her work or are familiar with it, and she also has, like me, graced the pages of the New York Times and has had cover stories in the magazine. And there were a couple of stories that lent themselves to her photographs specifically because, for example, there is an essay about doing a cold water swim off the North Fork, and she had photographed that day. And during COVID, she took photographs of families that were sheltering in place, and so there was a photograph that matched one of the essays that talked about that. And so I asked her, well, what about including some of the photographs? And then it seemed odd to just include them for 2 or 3 stories. And so we sort of came up with this idea of, could we find other corresponding photographs that matched all the other stories? So Lindsay dove into her small archive of 300,000 photos, and and we found ones, and we're going to show you some that made it, some that didn't. And so I'm going to let her talk about what that was like for her a little bit to take photos that in one way or another had been rejected from either shows or books or shoots or and find a home for them.
Sorry, what was the
Good
question?
So what was
I'm
it like?
technically inept.
That's okay. We're having
as a photographer.
glitches. So, what was it like for you to go through? And I'm gonna try to not break this now.
Okay.
Your photos and find ones that potentially could correspond. These, just for a second, didn't make the book, but there were ones that got pulled because they all sort of, you talk. Why were those included?
I believe the first image was just, well, first of all, hi everyone. I just wanted to say thank you to April and Eric and Sherry and Kristen and all the people who work so hard to make this place what it is. It's an incredible, yes. I'm lucky. This is my second time up here, so thank you for having me again.
And thank you for saying that, because I was, I'm a little nervous, so things.
Oh, I'm not.
Things kind of don't find their way out. But from the minute I walked into this space, I was like, I don't know what I can do here, but it was a dream to be here and to do something in this space. And so this is a dream come true.
Yes. Okay, so the question is kind of what it was to dive into the archive. Number one, it's just such an honor to work with Michelle. I've admired your writing forever. You've been sharing your writing with your friends as long as we've known you. And it's just always, you always walk away from reading something of Michelle's having gained something and felt something really beautiful and moving. So given this opportunity, I don't often go back into my 300,000 image archive. That just is a testament to someone who needs to do some editing. That's a lot. That's way more images than we need. But I love the opportunity to kind of work backwards. Typically, I'll present an idea to my editors, and then I'll go out and shoot something, or I'll have a few images that I've already started and an idea, but I have a pitch, or I have an assignment. I'm given an assignment, and I go and do the thing. But this was really special because it offered me the opportunity to dig back through my images, which I rarely do, and kind of surprise myself in reading certain stories like, oh, I know the image. Even though it's from 15 or 18 years ago, like I have a real sense of what this image is. And we'll get to, I think, one story you want to highlight that I think was the image that I felt closest to. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about it, but it was really interesting to try and align, the photographic image with the images that you've conjured through your writing. And I thought we found some really interesting, and some of the pairings are more subtle than others, and some of them may be more literal. but we had some really interesting discussions. And so what we did was include a couple of the images that were rejected. And ultimately, most of these images have been rejected anyway because they're sitting alone in my archive, and many of them are just one-offs, and they would have probably never been used again. They're not intended for any particular photo essay, so I really love to be able to reclaim them and bring them out of the dark and into the light. So I like the idea of Andrina's photo with the horses that she rescued on the Shinnecock Reservation, as contrasted with the next image, which is a photograph I took for the New York Times, and it's Joey Wolfer with her horse. And both people, I would say, have a very intimate relationship with their horses and a really beautiful communication. But having reread the article, the first image made more sense to me than the second one. I mean, just two women from very different backgrounds, and there was something about the first image that I would say. There was rescue involved. There was, something a little more complex.
And this was paired with a story that is about being seen by a horse during a weekend of equine therapy. And so when we went back and forth between these, this one just conjured the communion that we were looking for. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about that notion of communion, because this was also a process when I decided to put the essays together. I really wasn't thinking about having photographs with it. The Modern Love column sort of gave me a different context for the notion of words being paired with art. So if you've ever read a Modern Love column, and then I also had something published in the Metropolitan Diary this past summer, both of those are paired with art. And there's something that I really love about that pairing of words and pictures. I am a great appreciator of photography. One of my great refuges in high school was to be in the dark room developing film, but I am a terrible photographer. And I'm a great art director, terrible photographer. So when I'm walking around, I could be like, that'd be a great shot. I could never get it the way that I see it in my head. And so I really appreciate that there are people who do, because it's not a skill I have, which leads me to something else that I wanted to talk about. And this book is very much a part of that. It was a part of that in some of these essays that I did in the New York Times. Lindsay could probably talk about it in terms of her New York Times Magazine stories, where she's working with journalists to tell very important and vulnerable stories, is this notion of collaboration. Because I think that we've gone through this era for a little bit of time. I mean, I'm also a filmmaker, and we have social media, and there's this notion that you have to be good at everything. You have to be the writer and the editor. You have to be the producer, the director, and the screenwriter. And it can really be pretty awful in a way, because we are not all good at every single thing, nor should we need to be. And for those of us, particularly women a lot of times, like we've had to put something on pause for a number of years while we were raising children. And we're coming to our deepest time of self-expression a little bit later in life. And so having to learn the whole skill set of a particular kind of software, or how to promote yourself on social media, or how to edit film, can be really tiresome and not so great. So this notion of collaboration, I think, is really exciting to me. And I did a lot of things alone in life. I raised a child alone. I moved to the West Coast alone. And I'm really much more interested in this notion of what can we do together? Where can your skills complement my skills? And so this is has been a great expression of that. And I've had to do that in some of the films that I'm working on, and I had that when I worked with Dan Jones at the New York Times, who's just an incredible editor. And it's like, wow, I don't miss a thing, and it's far tighter, better than it was at the beginning. So I just want you to think about collaboration and where are the things that you might be working on that could be benefited by the skill set of somebody else. And so Lindsay and I talked about this, like, has anybody seen the movie Slumdog Millionaire? So that notion of, like, he wins for those who have not, it's a guy on a game show, and it's like a Who Wants to Be a Millionaire kind of game show. And they're asking him these questions, and he wins the show because they kind of cut to, he had had the, like, horrible experience after horrible experience in his life that made him have the answer to the questions. And that's what has him win the prize. And I think the creative process can be like that. It can feel grueling sometimes, and yet in retrospect, you sort of see that all these individual moments, sometimes that were very hard and challenging, were necessary to come up with a final product. And so I love this notion that I had to have thousands of lived experiences and go to different places, from LA to Paris to East End of Long Island, and I did realize a lot of the stories take place out here. And Lindsay had to go to, I don't know, where'd you go in some of those photos?
In the photo? Oh, these photos?
Yeah, the photos that ended
I
up
mean,
Michigan and
yeah, Michigan. These all feel somewhat
East End.
domestic. East End, within the United States. That's not to say I haven't traveled a lot. That hasn't affected my vision over time. But yeah, I would say most of these are more local.
But Lindsay has lived lots of lived experiences that gave her the perspective and eye as an artist that she has, and I've had lots of lived experiences that have given me the eye and perspective that I have. And we really believe that the sum is greater than the parts for doing so. And so I would ask you to consider places in your own work where somebody else's skill set could really benefit what you bring to the table.
Yeah, and if I can just say, as a photographer, Michelle's really given me some things to think about, because I don't really think of myself as a collaborator. I really think that it's kind of a lonely business being a photographer. It used to be a dark room. It used to be, you would just go out. It's you and your camera. But things are not published, and things don't come to fruition with just one person. There's your subject. There are the editors. There are the publishers. There are teams of people who are getting together to create this story, just not necessarily with you. So it's sort of a distant collaboration. It feels like there's a bit of a disconnect for me. Right. And I'm not someone who's a great collaborator. I mean, of course, with Michelle, I love collaborating, but I grew up in a really wild household with too many people and too many dogs and cats and gerbils and fish and like way too much of everything. So I really treasure being someone who works alone. But it becomes reclusive at times, and I feel like, wow, I'm feeling really socially anxious. Oh, maybe I should actually step out of my studio. Mm-hmm. And I mean, getting out and taking pictures. It takes me out of my comfort zone every time. I'm never comfortable. I have two subjects right here who I loved photographing, Ruby and Alan, for my Meet Your Neighbor project. And I have to say, to go to your house, and I was a perfect stranger, and to photograph you, you were so warm and welcoming and lovely, but it's not easy. I think that's what makes it maybe better. I think I'm a better photographer because I'm not comfortable, because no one's comfortable having their picture taken, and I think we're kind of sharing a similar experience of discomfort, and in that discomfort, maybe it's unspoken, we find comfort in each other. So you two are two of my favorite neighbors, so thanks for coming. Oh. Thanks, Ruby.
She is an artist. And I wanted to talk about this notion of artist and self-expression a little bit, because Steve, who was Lindsay and I are on tour apparently because we did the Artist and Writers Night at Almond a couple of weeks ago, and now we're here, and who knows where we'll be next. Somebody come up with something fun for us to do, please. And so when we were there, Steve, who's sitting in the back, said, the thing that I appreciate about you is that you lead with vulnerability, Michelle. And most people are really working hard to hide their vulnerability. And he said, is that by design? And I said, no, it's not by design. I actually worked really hard to hide my vulnerability. And we'll talk about that vis-a-vis a picture a little bit later on. And I had a friend who was dying, who I talk about in the book some years back, and she was this very strong Russian woman, successful realtor who worked with my dad at Douglas Elliman for a little while and lived out in LA where I lived. And she was so vulnerable, and it surprised me, but it really taught me that vulnerability, that strength is not the absence of vulnerability, it's the presence of it. And I started to shift a paradigm for myself. And I think that expression, whether it's painting or photography or writing, is the ultimate expression of vulnerability. And I was leading a seminar last week for an essay scholarship that's run by the Elie Wiesel Foundation. And this businessman came and talked to us, who helps fund the scholarship. And he said, we are entering into a time, the human economy. And I think this matches with this notion of collaboration sort of changing. And in the human economy, what is valued is the heart. And why is that important? Because machines, as we're seeing, are going to be able to replace a lot of the skills that we do, but they're not going to be able to replace the human heart. And so there used to be something that was called conspicuous consumption, which if you live out on the East End, fortunately, well, I mean, there exists something called conspicuous consumption, which is that you work hard to have your watch and your key fob or your car or your home or the clothes you're wearing indicate to other people what your worth is. And what he said to us is that we are entering into a time of conspicuous expression, which is where our value will come from our ability to be vulnerable, to be authentic, to express ourselves, to put our art out in the world. One of the things I really love about young people, I have a 24-year-old son, and there's his peer group, like they're all neurodivergent and they all have a thing, and they're open and supportive about their thing. Like my son's best friend is one of the most talented musicians I've ever met. And my son had to, for all of high school, tie his shoes and put his belt loops in. He'll never drive a car. His mind works in a different way. And he's one of the most creative people I've ever met. And his mind doesn't work the way that mine does. And so I think that authenticity is really revealing itself not to be a deficit to be hidden, as Steve pointed out that night, but one to be showcased, to be worked with, to understand in that sense of collaboration. Actually, you know what? It's really easy for me to tie your shoes, but it's not so easy for me to arrange a piece of music, and my film needs a piece of music. And sort of looking at where we can kind of match these things with each other. So because there's so many creators in here, I thought, Lindsay, maybe you could talk a little bit about where you found your permission to create.
I think that would go back to my mother is incredibly creative, and I witnessed her just kind of painting, even just, I've said this before, but just watching my mom arrange flowers as a kid, I feel really gave me a sense of composition. and weight and placement and light, and I just remember those observations as being particularly memorable and having an impact on me. But for me, it was just my grandfather giving me a subscription to National Geographic, and that was, I knew I wanted to be a photographer, and I'm not that kind of photographer, I don't think, but I was so inspired, and I would just take that magazine and spend this time alone to see these other parts of the world that I was not privy to. We did not travel at all as a kid, so when I was 18, I became an exchange student in South Africa. I just decided I need to get out of here and I will go wherever Rotary Youth Exchange will have me. And I went with a camera, and I've been taking pictures ever since. I remember the first photo I took that really resonated with me. It was 3 young women with baskets on their head in Swaziland, and they were making fun of me and laughing, and I just remember being so uncomfortable, but laughing with them. And the image, it resonates with me because I feel my own discomfort still in looking at it. That, to me, is a bit of, it's acceptance and rejection. It's like a push and pull, you know? I'm giving a lot of thought to rejection lately, and I don't know if anybody phone banked, but doing the phone bank is like the ultimate rejection. I can't believe, I felt like I was in 8th grade again. I was so hurt by people's responses, and you just feel like, wow, one of the first things they coach you with the tools is, it's not personal. It's not personal. This is not about you. And that's what we've been having a lot of discussions around this. And just this feeling of being rejected. I think I'm very thin-skinned. I think my husband would probably attest to that. But the difference between myself at 58 and myself at 28 was that I couldn't handle rejection. I really thought it was about me. And now I realize it's about the work. It's about the panel, the jurors. It's about timing. It's about so many more things, and really not at all about you. For me, it's been about mostly timing, I think, for my particular projects around LGBTQ plus youth. But yeah, I jumped all over the place. Where are we now?
We are at the permission to create. And I mean, I'll talk a little bit about my own sense of permission to create, because I did not grow up writing. I loved books. I wanted to be locked in the library overnight. I mean, when we came out here, I mean, there was sort of a feeling of rejection, because I'd go into town and I'd go to Penny Lane and I'd hide out in the bookstore, and all these like pockets of tweens that knew each other from wherever, summer camp or someplace that I didn't belong, were all hanging out together, and I was not. And then I later found this deep sense of belonging with a lot of the women and mothers in this room. And what I would do is I would write and often not finish things. And so I would write pieces and I just wouldn't see them to their completion. And then I developed the skill. So I really think that first there is this notion of giving yourself permission to create. And I mean, that can be really simple. Like, we can just tell you all today, you have the permission to create whatever it is: a flower arrangement, a meal, an outfit, decor of a room. And so you have permission to create. And I'll tell you why that's important in a second, whether you share it with the world or keep it for yourself. And then there's this notion of submitting it. Which we're going to talk about in a second. But why it's important to create is, one of the things that I've done is I've worked in the prison system, and I've written curricula on having prisons be trauma-informed rehabilitation centers. And a while back, and then I've also worked with literacy and youth, and teaching youth was predominantly at first in the inner city in Los Angeles, classic and spoken word poetry. And Jimmy Santiago Baca was a man who became poet laureate of California, and he was illiterate, and he learned to read and write in prison. And I went to see a documentary about him once. and he was there, and somebody asked him, how do you reduce recidivism rates? And he said, you give people self-expression. And the person who asked the question wasn't very satisfied with this answer. I immediately understood that that was the answer. Because when you think about somebody like Joan Didion, who says, I write to figure out what I'm feeling, or my cousin was here from Rome for a couple of weeks and we went to the Pollock House, and I've been to the Pollock House many times before. And there were these great docents there that day. And I was asking the question, was it fair that Peggy Guggenheim got to keep all of his paintings? So he got to keep none of his paintings. And we were kind of exploring this question as I was there. And I learned a few different things. I learned that, well, maybe it was fair because she bought him a house, she gave him food and a car and paint supplies, and he wasn't Jackson Pollock at the time. He was just an alcoholic painter who was getting himself into trouble in New York. And the idea was, let's remove him from that environment and maybe he'll be okay. So that was interesting. What I didn't know is that what somebody shared is that they said, I kind of think that Jackson Pollock was a shaman. And they said, he had this pet crow named Caw Caw. And, this crow would like come inside and hang with him and scare other people away and all sorts of interesting things. And what I didn't know is the poor paintings that they don't like the name drip paintings because then they called him Jack the Dripper and people didn't like that. So the poor paintings, which I learned are called the poor paintings, were all, for the most part, created in a 2-year period when Jackson Pollock was sober. And they were the way in which he dealt with his experiences and emotions. They were a catharsis more than they were a form of art. And so when I think about, is expression important? Expression really can heal us. It can transmute something complicated that is inside of us, an experience that we've had or we don't understand, into something that is tenable, that is manageable, and that is maybe even beautiful. And so that is sort of the power of art, and I think everybody should have that, whether they share it with people or not. And so the docent said, for him it was done. He worked through whatever rage, whatever depression, whatever complication he may have been feeling, and then it was like, kind of like, I made a joke, sorry, this is my humor. My friend said, I don't want to keep this in the bedroom, I think it's bad juju, So I said, well, it wasn't intended to be kept in the bedroom, it was intended to keep in the bathroom, because they're all about the perfect length for a visit to the bathroom, and there you want to reject something. But, we want to have these experiences, digest them, and then reject the part of us that no longer serves us. And art is a great way to do that, to transmute or alchemize a feeling. And so then there's this other layer, which is, okay, first we give ourselves the permission to create, and then there's this notion of, can we share that with other people? Can we commodify that? Can we make it our livelihood? So Lindsay, I thought maybe you and I could both talk a little bit about what that experience of actually like working up the nerve to submit, to apply for a fellowship or a grant, to send your work to a magazine. Like, how did the New York Times covers come about? Anything you want to share?
Well, the New York Times covers came about, it's a bit of a story, but there was a story being written about children at a camp. It was a camp for families and their gender expansive children, kids who did not identify sort of as society would expect them to, mostly kids assigned male at birth who presented more female given the choice. And there was a story being written by the New York Times Magazine by a writer named Ruth Potower. And I was taking a workshop down in Charlottesville and with Maggie Stieber, the photographer. And she told me about this story that's happening, and she saw my photographs, and she said, why aren't your photographs being used to illustrate the story about the kids we're talking about? And I said I had submitted them to the writer, and she wasn't able to get through with her editors. And she said, well, Kathy Ryan's here, who was the director of photography at the New York Times Magazine, and let me talk to her. And by the time I left Charlottesville, I not only had the story, but I had the cover story. I mean, it just, they were using a Dutch photographer who had photographed some transgender children in a garden. Beautiful images that they did end up, giving this person a shot, because I did take their story from them. But I thought it was really important to represent the story with the actual kids. And so a lot came from that. We had a documentary at camp. I published a book in 2015, and then I went to a portfolio review at the Bronx Documentary Center, and I sat with Kathy Ryan again, and I said, I have an idea. Remember the kids? Like, they're older now. Can we do a decade later? Like, where are the kids now? Let's let them speak for themselves. Their parents have always advocated for them, but we haven't really heard from them. So she loved the idea, and we ended up putting the same kid on the cover in 2012, again in 2022. And this is young man who identifies as male and gay, and he's a fashion designer. And my whole collaboration with the kids, so I am a collaborator, is we look at an image that I've selected from camp back when they were 7, 8, 9 years old, and I say, look at what you were wearing. Find an outfit that speaks back to this. If these were to hang together, how do they work together? You can choose an outfit, you can choose a mural, you can choose anything that you think coordinates in some way back. So these can hang together, and then I want you to tell me your story and your journey and how you feel about being used right now. I mean, the target of politicians. I mean, these kids have a lot to say. They're going through a really hard time. They are just kids trying to live authentically in the world. So this has been a really important project, and I do plan to continue to photograph them as they become adults, as they form their families. And I'm off to the Midwest this week, to Illinois and Wisconsin and Michigan, to photograph hopefully 8 other kids who are now between the ages of 18 and 25. Did I answer the question?
Well, I have a few more questions, but Lindsay also, I mean, even though she says she doesn't like speaking, she did an amazing TED Talk on this topic that you can Google and
Thanks.
look up
Yeah.
not too long ago. And what about that feeling of when you sent work out and got rejected? How do you deal with that?
I mean, I don't generally send, what I do is I pitch ideas, and I get crickets. I don't even get rejected. That's the rejection, which to me is very, I think, unfair, because, I'm coming up with these ideas, I'm submitting work, I'm creating stories for your magazine. I think people should always respond. I just do. Not interested right now. Or
No, period.
no, just say something.
Yeah.
So right now I have 4 kind of major grants out in the world, and they hurt. I don't expect to receive these grants, and if I do, it's a big win. And if I don't, you go back to your space, and you don't take it personally, and you continue to create, because you go back in your mind. Is this important, what I'm doing? Do I still love it? Are these people important? Do they have a message that, I can help them, give them a platform to speak? Yes, and yeah. I do have to go back in my mind and remember, why am I doing this? And is it still meaningful to me? I'm not making money doing it, that's for sure. No, right now I rent my house and I apply for grants. And that's how artists survive on the East End of Long Island, I suppose. Unless they sell their work, of course, but
Unless they what?
sell their work. I mean, not everybody wants to have a giant photograph of a, transgender girl on their wall. It's not like that kind of work. It's
Julie
more,
has one.
unless you're Julie Hatfield, and I love the frame.
Why don't you talk to us about some of the pictures? You tell me when you want to
Well, why don't you say something about that? Because that's just,
Oh,
I threw
well,
that in because it is the last line of one of her stories.
this did not make it. This was rejected from the book, but there is a story that is a rejected letter to the editor about when Harry met Sally. And so there is a line in it about coconut cake with chocolate sauce on the side, if you know that movie. So she found coconut cake.
And
It's-
I shot that for a cookbook.
Mhm.
So it was kind of funny to put in there. I find this image really sad, you know, just for
Except-
reasons that it was a really hard time in our lives with one of our kids. And so for me, it brings back really complicated feelings about, you know, just someone going through some stuff. So it appears blissful and peaceful and hopeful, and there's a rainbow. But to me, this is a sad time. This is a hard time.
And yet, it gets paired with a story that is about a moment when I finally really harnessed my sense of self-worth. So it's sort of, I'm a big believer in polarity, and to know something, you need to know its opposite. So to know belonging, you need to know rejection. So to me, I didn't actually know that part of the story. So that's really interesting that it was taken during a hard time for her, and the hard time sort of was the other side, all the years that led up to the moment that happens in this essay. And this
Also, can I just say, I just think it's kind of interesting to reinterpret images through your stories. I mean, that's been also part of the process, is to read your stories and like, this was not the intention of this image, or is this never would have conjured up these feelings, but then having put them in a pairing with your words, it's an opportunity to reinterpret the image.
And I mean, I think that speaks to a lot of, again, going back to this notion of collaboration, that all kinds of things get born in the space of two people that are bigger than the individual creators. And so I think that sort of is the magic that happens. It's one of the reasons that I like theater. I sort of started in playwriting, and it's a living kind of work. You know, every night it's different. There is the chemistry of the actors on the stage. There is the weather that day. There's whatever's going on in the zeitgeist, whatever's going on with politics. There's the audience, and then they meet in the space in between, and something new, never to be recreated again, gets created. And so there's sort of a magic. But in some way that happened, you know, here, that picture was an indication of that. And Lindsay, can you talk to us about this is the photograph that Lindsay said is sort of most meaningful to her in the book. So I'm going to let her talk about it. And then this is paired with a short essay called E Pluribus Unum that I will read so that you have a little bit of a sense of some of the writing in the book.
And will you just skip to the second image? Because
Yes.
I think both images were powerful for me. This is my neighbor, Mehmet Carter, who was 102 when she died in Sag Harbor with her great-granddaughter. And I photographed them as part of the Meet Your Neighbor project. And it was just really amazing to sit with someone who is 100 years old to tell you about the history of Sag Harbor, things you could not even possibly imagine. I could have sat with her for days and just listened to her. I loved that she drank whiskey at night and watched football, and she had like this whole like cool routine. And then, you know, she was 102. But the image I chose to represent the story is of my neighbor of origin. I grew up in Metro Detroit, a suburb of Detroit, and there was a couple who didn't have children, Patricia and Edward Dorsey, and they had an open door policy for all the children in the neighborhood. Any time of day, you were welcome to go into their house. She'd have her art supplies out. She was a marathoner. Currently, she has MS. She's been wheelchair bound for as long as I can remember now, like 25 years. But when you look back, when I knew her, she was this like young redhead who just could not produce enough art or run enough marathons, triathlons. And today she's in her 80s. I'll see her next week. She's one of my best friends in the entire world. And like I said, I had a chaotic not childhood, but my house was insane. And she lived down the block, and I would just go into her house so I could just lay on my stomach. There were always cats being birthed in the closet. I mean, there were just kittens everywhere. There were bunnies, there was ping pong, and the kids would just go there. And some of the kids really needed to be there. You know, they were there because they didn't want to go home. And as long as there was no loud voices or roughhousing in the Dorsey home, you were welcome. And so she's been a mentor to me. She's actually one of my Guggenheim recommenders because she is the person I believe who knows me the best and the longest, more than I would say my parents.
Does she
or
know
my
the pictures
siblings.
in the book?
Yes, she knows. She
Okay.
knows. Yeah, yeah. So I'm bringing some friends to meet her next week, and she's just a very special person. So, and they have a beautiful bond. They're, you know, her husband's in his 90s. He was a psychiatrist. His father worked with Freud. They have a really interesting history, but just their bond and the bond that she still has with children who are now my age and older, we're all very connected to this couple. So.
I love that. And, you know, you've touched on a couple of times, like coming from a chaotic household. I know you have 4 siblings, and then I didn't know about all the animals, gerbils and dogs and cats. And I kind of came from the opposite of that. My parents both worked. My brother was 6 years older, so he was often beyond where I was, and so I was often in a house alone. And so you can see where each of that would affect our perspectives and who we are and how we create. And so that makes for a really logical pairing in my mind, because she has a perspective that I didn't have. When I wanted the chaos, I went to my godparents' house, who are here, and they had 4 kids and cats and all kinds of other things. And I got to be in that environment and jump in pools and make food and do all kinds of fun shenanigans. So yeah, I mean, just this thing that, like, I could never have lived that is not part of my imprinting, and mine is not part of her imprinting, and so something different and new gets created in that space. Jonna, when she interviewed me on WLIW the other day, was nice enough to remember that 4 years ago she interviewed me. Hello, Percy, that was my dog. And we considered other dogs, but we gave him the place in the book. These are some images that Lindsay took during COVID, where she took pictures of families who were sheltering in place. Empty streets in Sag Harbor, other families. I know you.
Some familiar faces.
Well, before I get
Those
to
poor high school students, they broke my heart. Oh yeah. So I just focused on some of the empty spaces, which I'm sure they look the same when they're empty now, but the feeling of the emptiness at the time was just heart-wrenching. I went into the Whalers Museum, and this man was playing, I can't remember his name, someone probably knows him, but he plays the organ. And he let me sit there and listen to him and photograph the church while he played. Oh, okay. He's a lovely man. It was a really nice experience. I remember Bay Street Theater.
where we hope you'll go at 2:30 today.
Right.
This was part of, there's an essay in the book about me going into the 40-degree water after I saw, and this also talks to you, speaks a little bit to the notion of how art can inspire things in life, how pictures can change your life in a way. I sort of had a lifelong fear of the cold, and Lindsay started taking a series of photos of people who did cold plunges and winter swims out here. And that's me in the water with a woman named Patricia Garcia Gomez. And I had seen this photo that Lindsay had taken and this photo of her swimming in a snowstorm. And I said, hey, I want to do that. And
She's 365 days a year, no matter what. Illness, nothing stops her.
And, and as I said, I spent a lot of time doing things alone in my life. And this was kind of a moment of realizing, do I want to perpetuate that narrative throughout my entire life, or do I want to start to switch that narrative? And I wrote to her on Instagram and said, hey, would you take me into the water? And she said yes. And then I asked Lindsay, do you want to come and photograph it? That's the after, yeah. That was when we made it out.
Sometimes I'm shooting film, sometimes I'm shooting digitally. I have to say, the film is just prettier, right?
I'll stop here for 1 second just because I didn't ever think I'd be sitting here talking with a giant-sized photo of me in a bathing suit behind me. And I really debated whether or not to put this photo in the book. People in general, women in particular, can be quite critical about their bodies. You said, I don't know when a photographer takes my picture, what am I going to look like? It's intimidating. Steve made this comment about leading with vulnerability. My mother said, you're not going to put that in the book, are you? She said, you've been working out for 2 years now and you look a lot better. I'm like, well, that's the way it was on that day, Mama, So, and I really hemmed and hawed. And, a friend wrote to me because she said, in a week's time, I'm going with a colleague to the Korean spa, and it's going to be the first time I'm going to have to be naked in public, and I'm terrified. And your book arrived in the mail, and I opened to this page, and I just started weeping. And you gave me the courage that maybe I can do that. Maybe by the time I turn 50, I'll be okay with my naked body. Thank you. Thanks. Do you want to date me? This is the Unity Project. And so Jonna was nice enough to remember that 4 years ago, 2 days ago, I fulfilled this dream that I had as a child of a bunch of people. I don't know, there's nearly 200. Somebody can count them if you want, if you're OCD like I am. And standing together for unity. And this was on October 18th, 2020. Me and my team were on the radio back then. And I thought that's a good backdrop to read this story. So I'm going to read this story, and then we'll take some questions, and then we'll send you off into your day. And I was living out here on 9/11 with my 1-year-old son, and then you'll sort of hear what happens after. As we approach the anniversary of 9/11, I can't help but reflect on Thursday, September 13th, 2001, when I was called in as a crisis intervention counselor for the employees who worked at Windows on the World, the iconic restaurant at the top of North Tower. 2 days prior, many of the men and women I'd met with arrived at work to see the buildings on fire and people jumping out of windows. They all lost coworkers. They all lost their job sites. They all lost faith. Nothing in my clinical training at New York University taught me how to handle what was before me. Like so many other emergency responders, whether paramedics or firefighters, or social workers, we were in uncharted territory. On the Tuesday when the towers fell, I was living on the east end of Long Island with my 1-year-old son. I immediately said yes when I got the call to come in and help. Due to bridge and tunnel closures, I couldn't get into Manhattan until Thursday, and the first thing I noticed was that even amid tattered flyers with photos of the lost, there was a palpable sense of calm and cohesion on the streets. As a native New Yorker, it was something I'd never felt before. I arrived at the location I'd be counseling and met with employees in groups of 20 or more. People shared their stories, they listened to each other, what they'd seen, how they felt, the shock, the horror, the irreconcilable loss. I expected that, but what I didn't expect was this. As I was wrapping up the first group, an older woman spoke out. "Before we go, can I say something?" She looked around the room and was met with agreement, and so I let her lead. She stood up and reached for the hands of the people on either side of her. Almost as if by magic, separate individuals transformed into a circle where everyone was unified and holding hands. "Let us remember those who lost their lives," she said. "Let us remember their families. Let us thank the nurses and doctors and rescue teams who are working tirelessly. Let us give thanks for our own lives. And above all, may we be kind to each other." This spontaneous circle of remembrance and gratitude happened at every group that day. Different leaders spoke different words, but the sentiment was the same. The groups were diverse in every way, yet they didn't seem to care if the hand they held on either side of them belonged to someone of a different gender, a different race, a different religion, or a different sexual orientation. They didn't inquire into the person's political affiliation or immigration status. They didn't mind whether we were all talking to God, or God spelled G-D, or Allah, or Mother Earth. In those few days, in our unfettered fear and grief, we were the same. We were one. Over these past years, and particularly through the global pandemic, I reflected on that Thursday. We are now so much more focused on what divides us than on what unites us. What happened? Why isn't a pervasive sense of empathy sustainable? The United States is not even 300 years old. With the exceptions of the native people of this land, our Shinnecock brothers and sisters, and the people brought here as slaves, many of us share a similar history. We are immigrants or children of immigrants. Either we were escaping something bad, hoping for better, or both. My mother and her family left Sicily to find opportunities after World War II, and my father's family came from Italy seeking help for his younger brother with Down syndrome. That day of crisis intervention counseling at a critical time in our nation's history humbled me. It was a concrete experience of our national motto, E pluribus unum, out of many, one. That day, I learned how to go on after or amid unthinkable tragedy. We do it by standing together.
So much. We do have a few moments for some questions, so we do want to open it up to the audience. Please wait for the microphone to come to you, and are there any questions? Just raise your hand. Cool.
Good afternoon, ladies, and thank you so much for taking the time to come here today and to share your experiences, how your careers have evolved, and we're all really grateful for the time you're spending with us. I had a question. You talked about vulnerability, but you also talked about authenticity. Can you, I mean, at face value, they sort of sound maybe mutually exclusive, but then at the same time, they sound like they would cross over. Can you talk about how they influence different portions of what you did? Do you have milestones like within your growth and your experience? Does that make sense?
You want to take it? I mean, I think authenticity first requires a certain level of self-awareness, and a curiosity about probing what is this thing that is happening? What do I feel about this thing? Have I really moved to the other side of it and considered it from the other person's perspective enough before I say something about it? So for me, at least, the authenticity is not reacting, but slowing down and really getting curious. My dog was up there a little while ago, and one of the things that having a dog taught me is that when they don't know something, they see the world through smell, and when they don't know something, they roll in it and they want it like all over them. And so when I am reactive or confused about a particular person or situation, I really get curious, and I want to know more. I want to see it from all the perspectives. I don't dig into my own. And then I think the vulnerability is sharing that, or saying, hey, I don't understand what your side is of this. Can we talk about it? And somehow in our current culture, we just want to like do that to the people that are saying things that we don't agree with, rather than ask them, what's that like for you? Since Lindsay has done so much work in the trans community, I think the movie Will and Harper, which, if some of you have gotten the chance to see, it's free on Netflix. It's about Will Ferrell going on this road trip with his friend who transitions to being a woman at about 60. And really a lot of what they do is just ask the hard questions together. Thank you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this whole presentation. I have a question. I liked what Lindsay was saying about being in the discomfort of the photography. And I have a question about, so there's a process where you create, and then there's that gap between sharing to the world. And I feel like for myself sometimes, it feels like it doesn't have the right environment to fit in. And it's like, where is it, like you said, when you're in a live play, you have this context and this audience, and it becomes part of a bigger kind of community. How do you find that right context? Because I feel like part of the rejection is that the environment doesn't fit your work. Like it's not ready for it, maybe it's not the right timing, but is there a process you'd say to find that environment, just keep trying? Or is it changing the world to a degree so that it fits the art you're trying to create?
I think the answer would be very different between writers and photographers, because I know, I was thinking today about like how did I get my work out there, or how do I make connection? I mean, it's expensive. You have to do portfolio reviews. You have to get, it's very hard to find a community. You have to insert yourself into these situations. So I imagine for writers, I mean, it's about attending conferences and staying connected and sticking with a project for a long time and believing in the project, and not losing faith and heart and energy. And it's really hard, I think. But if you care enough about what you're doing, you'll have a strong enough conviction that I think you can't let it go. Like, it's something you have to do. But as for from a writer's perspective, what would you say?
Well, I mean, I'm a little bit of a magical thinker, which, you'll see if you read the essays in the book. But so I can't sort of remove that from my lens, and I'll use Lindsay as an example, or I'll use a couple of things. After living on the West Coast for 13 years, and then I came back and was living upstate, it was a particularly icy winter, and I was just there with my dog, and sometimes there'd be like 10 days when I wouldn't see a human. I was getting a little weird. And I would go outside and make these like mosaics with my boots and do all kinds of crazy things. And one day I was out there, and I had seen pictures of what the property looked like in the spring, so I knew what kind of trees were on the property. And, I said, like, the lilac bush is not waiting here all winter saying, come spring, should I be an apple tree or should I be a lilac? It just is waiting for the right time and the right conditions, and then life force will move through it, and it will be what it was born to be. And I think that we are really like that too, except that we have a lot of chatter about what our art should look like or what our writing should look like, and then that confuses us. And so I think the best thing we can do is get out of our own way so that life force can move through us and be what we were born to be. I think that's number one. And then I tend to think that, like, the universe is conspiring along with us. So, like, when Lindsay tells that story of being in the right place in the right time to, you know, a whole bunch of other people were conspiring to get her to be the photographer who matched those images with that particular story. And I think that life does work that way. You know, I'll go back to Modern Love just because it's here and it's in the paper today. When I wrote the story that ended up being my first Modern Love piece for a live spoken storytelling event like The Moth, and the theme was death. So I would have never thought that that was a Modern Love piece. And I got off the stage that night and people said, "That was amazing. That's a Modern Love piece." And so I was like, "Oh, okay." And I submitted it. But I wouldn't have done that because I wasn't thinking of it as a love piece. It was about my relationship with my son. I had this narrow perspective that if I wrote a Modern Love piece, it would be about romantic love. Both of my pieces were not about romantic love. They were, you know, both about my son. And so, you know, sometimes we get in our own ways. And so a big part of the process is getting out of our way so that things can flow.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you for this very insightful, meaningful presentation. It means a lot to me. I just wanted to say I moved out here about 24 years ago and lived in Manhattan, lived in Europe, was used to always being pretty loudmouthed about my opinions, and just felt free to be able to say and speak what I felt and what I thought, but always with the premise that I wanted to hear the other side as well. For whatever reason, I feel I've kind of lost that courage out here. I feel people don't respond. I don't know what they really think. I'm kind of left to put the pieces together, and that for me, is kind of taking away what I enjoy most, is communicating with other people. So what you were presenting and the points that you made all make sense to me and are very encouraging.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mona.
Any other questions?
This is our final question.
And please remember to go downstairs and see Robin's work. It's open studio time. There's books that are signed in the back, and the lovely Julie. And
Hi, I want to thank you for bringing up a subject that's so essential to being an artist, which is getting rejected. And I just want to say that you'll feel better if you get rejected than to not submit at all. Thank you.
Good point.
I think that's a perfect
That's a
note
perfect-
to end on. Right? Go ahead.
No, it's a great note to end on.
It is. Thank you so much, ladies, for being here. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you for
Thanks,
having
everyone.
us. Thank you.